Hi, it's Kai, and this is Un-American. In Un-American, I invite international experts to share their perspectives on US-related issues and to add new angles to inherently American debates. In this episode, I speak with sociologist and former Hungarian parliamentarian Gábor Scheiring about the slippery slope to autocracy and the lessons US voters should heed from Hungary's democratic collapse. Gábor Scheiring, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you very much for having me.
So, Gábor, this is my first time recording for a while. In fact, I think the last episode that I recorded was back when Donald Trump had just taken office. And I think part of that break was because I was being swamped with work. And part of that break was also that I was needing to really wrap my head around the new reality that came with this new administration in the US. I think alongside the frustration of seeing Trump win again, there was this almost paralyzing sense of being overwhelmed by the whole thing. And not just by the years ahead, 4 more years of Trump, but also by how quickly the backsliding really started, both in scale and in intensity right after the inauguration. Is that moment of frozen, let's call it disbelief and inaction, is that a shortcoming on my part, or do you think it reflects something deeper?
I would never say to anyone that their feelings are shortcomings. So I don't think this is a shortcoming in any sense. In many ways, I was also shocked, both Trump, but I think in general, the world is headed in a direction where it's increasingly difficult to find hope. And a lot of it has to do with the increasing political influence and power of radical right populist or liberal actors across the globe. So yes, I share your sense of frustration and shock. On the other hand, I also had a feeling that, let's put it that way, that the mainstream or centrist commentary and analysis, a large part of journalism, certainly the Democratic Party and small d Democrats in the global West, I think have been underappreciating the force and threat of illiberalism for quite a few years. And I think in some sense the COVID created this false illusion that we are back to normal. You know, populists weren't really able in most countries to deal with that crisis. It required a lot of kind of strong central state involvement and technocratic expertise. It's not the kind of crisis that they would wish for. So that created this sense that we're back to normal. And this aligned with the general reading of liberal and centrist elites that populism, and especially Trump's first presidency, was just like a minor mishappening. It was just a glitch and the system is going back to normal. But my reading coming from Hungary and analyzing the rise of populism around the world has been that there's always a chance of Trump or Trumpism to come back. So in that sense, unfortunately, it was not a surprise. And also, if you just look at the campaign that the Democrats ran, I wouldn't say it was a big surprise for me, unfortunately.
Do you think there was also something generational maybe in that reaction? Because I felt my reaction, this frustration, this inability to cope with the whole thing was also kind of born out of me being a millennial, specifically being born in 1989, the year that the Berlin Wall came down. I don't think I was ever an apostle of the whole end of history argument or that humanity will get better and better and we'll live together more harmoniously as time goes on. But I do think there was part of me that couldn't really quite imagine certain political realities or social norms or certain debates being rolled back as far as they have been already. And I think that illusion has shattered not only with Trump's second term, but also with, like you just said, everything else that's going on. Israel's genocide of Palestinians, Russia's war on Ukraine. The clocks are turning back pretty dramatically. Do you think we're still underestimating how radically the political systems that we've built can be changed or can be undone even?
I think there's a general tendency to underestimate it. I wouldn't say everyone falls into that kind of trap or misreading of the global situation. I think agree with you that there is a generational element to that. So I think younger generations tend to be more frustrated with the liberal world order. We've lived through a series of major crises. Many of us have seen either no savings at all or just a very little savings wiped out on multiple occasions consecutively. So the sense of, the beginning of the adulthood is getting postponed and postponed by these consecutive waves of the crisis of the global liberal system, I think created this sense that there is this fragility. And if you don't fix that, and if there's no progressive response to that, then there's going to be an illiberal, radical right response. So I think there is certainly a generational element to that. But it's always hard to imagine systems that we are used to unravel so quickly. And while I thought that there is always a chance of Trump coming back in the US, the speed at which he is able to implement a series of these measures that point towards autocratization, that is, I think, surprising, even for most of the people who were kind of critical of this liberal world order, or at least elements of that, and were kind of expecting that populist revolt is not going away. But the speed, I mean, Trump is getting there where Orbán or Erdogan have gotten after 10 or even more years. So that's I would say really really frightening. There I think, of course, geographical dissimilarities as well in countries that haven't had long histories with democratization. It's easier to imagine the end of liberal institutions, whereas in countries that had multiple generations getting used to certain practice of liberal democratic politics and policymaking, it's harder to imagine for that to unravel. But I think the generational aspect is more relevant because we've seen across the global West young people getting disillusioned with democracy. And for good reason. I don't think that's just like some stupid nostalgia. I think there are very good material reasons for young people to get really angry with the system.
You've already gotten into a couple of points that I want to swing back to later. Frustrations with the material reality that you just mentioned. Also, the idea of certain guardrails, let's say, that are failing. Let me dive into something else first, and then we get back to that. Because, of course, the reason I'm interviewing you has to do with you being from Hungary, and Hungary having a very specific own history with authoritarianism. And you just mentioned Viktor Orbán. You just said Trump is really catching up quickly. Some might argue that under Viktor Orbán, Hungary is already a bit further down the line when it comes to dabbling with autocracy. When you think back to the time before Orbán, or to the time, let's say, when his party Fidesz was on the rise, was there any specific moment when you felt that something in Hungary was fundamentally shifting?
So I wouldn't say that in terms of institutional backsliding, the US is at the same point as Hungary. Hungary is, of course, one of the most advanced illiberal states, as Viktor Orbán put it. But the intensity of Trump's attacks, Orbán hasn't done it this intensively in the first few years. Nevertheless, I remember 2011, that was the year when we protested just the day before Christmas against a series of new laws that were being passed by the Fidesz majority in parliament. So we formed this kind of living chain around the parliament building, protesting against these measures. One of them was the complete rewriting of the electoral law, but they also Orbán and his loyalist MPs, they also changed the way the parliament itself is discussing laws, making it easier to push through controversial measures in just like basically a matter of days, like 48 hours. So that gave us a sense that politics as we knew it and democracy as we knew it is undergoing significant changes. So that was basically a little bit more than a year after Orbán took power. And that's when we started really strongly to kind of protest against this and warn the broader domestic and international community against democratic backsliding that was taking place in Hungary. And then it just continued, just like I think it was 2012. We were so desperate and frustrated with the way the parliament works. There was no chance to get our proposals kind of heard, even if some elements in some sense resonated with Orbán's priorities at that point, like, I don't know, regulating financial flows, international financial flows, and re-regulating banks and things like that. They were not open to any kind of discussion. So another kind of symbolic moment that I remember is that every year we came up with a alternative budget proposal and series of proposals that we introduced to the parliament. And then in 2012, we hired this machine, a bulldozer, to deliver it to the parliament, kind of as an act of symbolic protest, because what we felt is basically there's this wall, this symbolic wall that is being erected that just separates the opposition from power, but more broadly, society from power. So that was already a very strong sense of this is such a centralized government that it's not democratic anymore. And in the literature, it really fit the way it's being described. I wasn't aware of this literature at that point, but there is this technical term, executive aggrandizement, which refers to how the leader gets elected democratically, but then centralizes powers to a degree that the democracy just becomes basically a zombie democracy. It looks like it's living, but it's really the soul of democracy is dead already.
That's super interesting. I like both of those terms. Zombie democracy is my new favorite. I don't think that understanding is really there yet, neither in the United States nor in a couple of European countries that I could think of. One observation that I've made, not only in the US, but also in Germany, where I'm from, is that people tend to believe that autocracy is something that happens somewhere else. For many Americans, it's the idea, well, it's not going to take root here. Look at China, like that could never happen to us. In Germany, it's, well, look to the US, that could never happen to us. I think part of the mindset is this assumption that for autocracy to really take root, there has to be some kind of a spectacular event, like the constitution has to be broken or suspended. There has to be a coup. Somebody has to like storm the Capitol, even though in the US, you could say that has already happened a couple of years ago. But your work on Hungary suggests that the slide into illiberalism is much more gradual and almost banal, I would say sometimes. And I think that's very much what I feel like is happening in the US right now. It's so banal that people don't want to see it for what it is. First of all, do you agree with what I just said?
No, I fully agree with you. You raised multiple points. One is that indeed, I think Hungary is really a paradigmatic case of this modern phenomenon of democratic backsliding. It's really a classic example for this notion that democracy dies these days not through, not under the fire of tanks, by military leaders. You don't see those kinds of things. There's no violence on the streets or not significant violence. The democracy dies through the consecutive actions of elected leaders who introduce laws and regulations that centralize power and create a playing field that is tilted to a degree that it's just very, very hard to get rid of that. And in many cases, they can cite other countries that have something similar in place. But if you take the whole thing together, it amounts to a significant institutional restructuring. And this is what happened in Hungary. And I think it's Scheppele, this constitutional lawyer and sociologist who came up with this idea of this Frankenstate system of the constitutional framework, where you pick elements that you could say, look, the UK doesn't even have like a proper constitution. Why would you bother so much? So you just like pick these cases from different countries, but then if you put everything together, it amounts to an extremely tilted playing field. And it can be always argued that this specific instrument is not so dangerous, but over the years, it creates a situation where the life of the opposition is just significantly difficult. And I'm not saying it's completely impossible to get rid of these elected autocrats, because as long as there is a system of elections, it's possible to do that, but it's just becoming harder and harder as the playing field is tilted. And I wanted to get back to this other thing you raised about how difficult it is to imagine this happening, which is partly related to the fact that it occurs gradually, and we don't have this kind of sudden explosions of like a dictator, I don't know, storming the parliament building. But the other aspect is something that you alluded to, I believe, is that there is this notion that democracy is just like so deeply ingrained in the past that illiberalism or backsliding is just something that would happen to these others. It's being othered a little bit, you know. It is the stupid people in the east or south, they vote for populist parties. There's this whole literature that kind of explains this phenomenon with reference to, I don't know, Hungarians or Poles or whatever nation, just pick your favorite case, that these nations were never truly democratic, that their culture is just like that. So they get basically getting what they always wanted in that sense. So this whole kind of culturalist literature that sees this hard right populism as culturally determined, I don't particularly find that satisfying, and I would even add I find it a little bit annoying and elitist. So I think there's a big problem with that kind of literature. And to give you an example, which is more of a kind of a benevolent example or variant of the same argument, but it's nevertheless the kind of the same family of arguments, is when I was in DC in 2017 as a democracy fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy, I met really amazing researchers and democracy activists. But I had quite a few workshops where I had this feeling that, you know, this topic that you're researching with regard to Orbán, even though we just elected Trump, it's just not relevant for the US. Hungary is just such a unique case that it's just like there's nothing for us to learn. It's just like it happens that the bad guys are having the upper hand at the moment, but this is a democratic system that is going to survive no matter what. And now I was there again, just this time, because I'm a democracy fellow again, but with a different crew, the Kettering Foundation. They have this global democracy fellowship program. And they brought together us global fellows for a week in DC just now. And oh boy, the change in attitude, even humility of many Americans, of most Americans that I met there, in terms of how deeply messed up the situation is, and that they want to learn from Brazil, from Hungary, from all these other cases around the world, and that the US is not unique anymore. And I think as populism is gaining strength across the world and across the global West, I think that this kind of deep cultural separation of the South and East and the global West, I think is breaking down, and there is a growing number of people who think that that's just like not a productive way of explaining reality anymore. I don't think it ever was, but it made more sense at a time when you could argue that democracy and economic development will go on forever, hand in hand, whatever, in the future. In the 90s, it looked like it makes more sense, but now it's making very little sense.
I find that super interesting, and I see that in conversations with people at home in Germany often when I talk about the political situation in the US. I think baked into that whole idea is also this idea of a red line, the red line at which people will go out on the streets and protest and topple the autocratic or the coming autocratic regime. When I have these conversations with my German friends, sometimes they ask me, well, when Trump crosses this red line, when do you think that will be, and when will people take to the streets? But in that sense, I usually turn the question back to them and ask, what do you think that red line is in Germany? Maybe 20 years ago, someone would have said the red line is if a right-wing nationalist party enters parliament. Exactly. That has happened a long time ago. Maybe then the next red line was if the AfD, our right-wing nationalist party, gets 10%. They already had that. 20%, they already had that. They're now at 25%. And apparently that red line wasn't the red line, or nobody has cared about that red line enough to actually stop them. And I see the same thing happening in the US. This question of when does the pushback happen? Does it happen when US aid gets eliminated? Well, that doesn't concern me very much. Does it happen when one of your colleagues is fired because the organization doesn't get funding anymore? Well, that's just one person, when students get taken away by the police. when immigrants get taken away without criminal records, being illegally deported. So all these red lines have already been there. And either none of those red lines are enough, or maybe red lines don't really matter that much. What's your take on that?
So I really like the way you describe the situation historically, how the red line has been always pushed further and further. Like if we think back to the 90s, there was already radical right forces here and there, but then the idea was that, they won't gain more than, 5 or 8% maybe. But then it kept on increasing. And now the whole political landscape has been restructured. And now in many countries, it's basically a 50-50. And if the democratic side wins over by a few percentages, then it's a huge win. So we've gotten from illiberal populism around 5% to it reaching a point where it can form governments as majority actors. Of course, it unfolds at different pace in different countries with different political systems, so it's not a unified picture. But even in Germany, as you're saying, with the 20% for AfD, it's like a huge difference in contrast to various ones. And I think the big issue is that the intellectual and political elites of the liberal center have been unwilling to recognize the deep institutional and structural social and economic problems that liberal democracy has been producing for decades now. I mean, institutionally, it led to an increasing degree of political alienation. From the system of mass political parties, we got to a political system that is run by a few political experts and pundits, no meaningful party consultation, which was a cornerstone of mass liberal democracies as we knew it after the Second World War. The whole problem of economic inequalities, it's very hard to sustain democracy in a context of perverse income inequalities and wealth inequalities that we have for decades now. And it's just continues to get worse globally and in many countries. The housing situation, the deindustrialization, the loss of stable jobs, the real income stagnation. Even in Germany, I don't think there's a significant discussion on this, but if you break down the real income of Germans without the college degree, has more or less stagnated for decades now. In Hungary, if you break down the real income by income groups, the bottom 60% has gotten back to where it was in the early 80s by the second part of the 2010s. So, it was a real income decline and stagnation for 3 decades, including 2 decades of democracy. The same has been going on in the US. Then at the same time, you have a massive increase in housing prices, the rise of these shitty jobs in the service sector, the precarious employment, the zero-hour contracts. You add all of this together, then you can start to understand why people don't see a significant opportunity for a stable economic future. And then in the worst cases, like the US or UK, you have a rise in mortality even. Working class mortality crisis, the so-called deaths of despair crisis, increasing deaths from alcohol, suicide, and drug use. You had a similar situation in Eastern Europe, by the way, in the 90s. That's one of my research projects. If you take the average death rates of the 80s and you contrast it with the actual observed deaths in the 90s, throughout Eastern Europe, 7.5 million people died prematurely. That's a massive, massive demographic catastrophe. That was a consequence mostly of rapid economic transformation, deindustrialization, trade liberalization, and there's hardly any political discussion on that. This has reached or undermined the stability of 2/3 of income earners, so that is a large part of the middle classes, even in Western European countries and including the United States. So it's not a problem anymore of deep poverty. It's not a problem of underclass. It's the complete sheer economic desperation and futurelessness, almost complete working class and a large part of the middle classes as well. And there's no way you can sustain democracy based on that economic foundation. And I think that insight, that economy and politics go hand in hand, that democracy is a kind of compromise between competing social forces, and they will maintain that compromise as long as they benefit from that. So if people get to a point where they perceive that liberal democracy doesn't care for them, they ask the question, rightly so, why would I care for liberal democracy when liberal democracy doesn't care for me? And that's a situation that you want to avoid. And in countries where Democrats are still in power and have a chance to implement deep-seated reforms, I think that's what should happen. But maybe we are running ahead to the solutions already. But I was just kind of, I'm quite, as you can hear, I'm rather passionate about this topic. I also have a personal history with these issues in the 90s. My family experienced really material loss and even health problems. So initially I thought that that's just like a personal story, but then I realized that it's not just a personal story. It's not just about my family. It's the majority of Hungarians. But then it turns out that it's not just Hungarians. It's a common experience of large parts of working classes across Europe and the US.
I was just going to say it applies to the US very well in the sense that I recently read a statistic that said 60% of Americans cannot afford a $1,000 emergency payment for whatever, for a car, for a washing machine, whatever, which tells you the full story almost. If I was in that situation, I'm not, thankfully, but if I was, to be honest, I wouldn't even care about politics. I would care about how can I make that $1,000 payment. So I think that that economic situation tells you a lot about where the country is at. You would hope in this case of America that the Democrats are the ones to actually do something about that and oppose the Trump government in addressing those issues. But I think they've really fallen flat in the past years. And one might argue that that's an accident or they haven't figured out a strategy on how to counter this. But I think there's also a good argument to be made that they are complicit in the whole thing. What is your take on that? Do you feel like in a political system like the US, the established parties are complicit in the same way to capitalism at least and to actually furthering this economic inequality?
Yes, of course, the Democratic Party is a huge party with competing factions and competing groups and significant challengers emerging internally. Just look at the Democratic primary in New York recently. So, you know, it's not one set. And actually, what's inspiring about the US is this kind of ability or willingness at least to learn and at least experiment with this kind of new kind of progressive politics. I think Europe, in some sense, is behind that. There was a progressive wave in the 2010s, but it's largely just subsided. The European elites have really fought a nasty battle against Syriza in Greece. That was a really symbolic moment of subjugating this new left alternative. And ever since then, it's really ups and downs here and there, but the new left has really been beaten until now, and it's been the radical populist right that has given voice to these frustrations, which is really alarming because most of their answers are completely wrong, horrifying, but they at least get to the point of asking the questions. The problem is that mainstream liberals don't even ask the questions. They think that the system is working properly, and you can just muddle through with minor tweaks. And that's, I think, a major misunderstanding. And in many ways, it's a story of the neoliberalization of social democracy, both as a professional class in terms of how politics is being done, the policy experts, but also the increasing tightness of the revolving doors between business elites and the political class, including the left. So you're in politics for a few years, but then you switch to some high-paying job, either as an expert or some manager. So there's this revolving door between business and politics. The financing in the U.S., of course, is a huge part of the problem that makes the U.S. case even more obscene in contrast to Europe, where at least. But even in Germany, we have seen how the Social Democratic Party has become really just a progressive version of neoliberalism from the 90s on. And this has unfolded across the global West with various intensities. And initially it looked like a good idea, because still the majority of workers were hopeful that Social Democrats were their parties, and at the same time they could attract the new middle class voters. But then very soon the workers got fed up with that kind of politics, and many workers, as you were saying, just your strategy, your hypothetical strategy in a scenario where you face unexpected financial expenses, the same applies to workers. Many of them don't vote anymore. So it's not that all of them went from the left to the radical right. Many of them got completely apolitical, but many of them also switched to the radical right. And there's again a generational aspect, whereas older generations either remain loyal to their parties or just demobilized politically. And it's the younger generations that have higher proclivity to support radical right parties. We see this in Germany. We've seen this when the radical right broke through in Hungary in 2010, both Fidesz, but at that time Jobbik was an even more radical right party. It was a very young party, both in terms of leadership as well as the supporter base. So there's this generational aspect of the political afterlife of the neoliberalization of the centrist democratic parties. And this is such a system, such an ecosystem of businesses, centrist political parties, think tanks, that it's just like a world that you don't ever leave. You get your first job in your early 20s, and then it's just like a closed world. It's an echo chamber. The big newspapers, the parties, the businesses, the think tanks, it's an echo chamber. And you live mostly in a nice area, in some nice city in Europe, or in the suburbs, in the US, somewhere on the coast, and you have zero chance of encountering the actual social reality around you. So I think that these multiple causal forces created this situation where liberal elites, they haven't been really able to understand the situation, to listen to the plight of the people who are suffering. Very often they dismiss them as, in the case of Hillary Clinton, the basket of deplorables. It keeps on coming back, referring to these people as just like abhorrent in one way or uncivilized or whatever. So there's even this unwillingness to listen, and then the revolving doors out of this situation create this situation where the liberal center and the center left has really become the force of the status quo, for good or bad. It includes the remnants of liberal democracy that needs to be protected, but they also kind of feel that they want to protect the whole economic system around that. And if you step 2 or 3 steps back, what voters see is that is the radical right that has become the transformative force that wants to change the system, whereas Democrats are on the defensive. That's a big problem. You need a progressive democratic movement that understands that the system needs significant change if it wants to survive. And we need that kind of democratic politics. And I see signs of that emerging in the US. It might be re-emerging in the UK again, but we're just not there yet. I think the most significant parts of this ecosystem, this liberal democratic ecosystem, are still intact. And this is just basically an ongoing battle for the heart of the liberal center.
I had a very similar discussion with Nancy Fraser on an earlier episode that I recorded, and she said something that really resonated with me. And what she said was that Republicans had their rebellion with Trump, their internal revolution, and they let it happen. They didn't want to let it happen, but they let it happen, and it shifted their party to the right. But the Democrats have managed to not have that rebellion by suppressing it for the past, let's say, 10 to 20 years, and are still stuck with the status quo, as you just explained. I think it's very potent. I think part of this complicity in what is going on is not just the opposition, the Democratic Party, but what has really struck me in the United States is that I think before the second Trump administration, you still had this assumption of the guardrail, the institutions that will stop the administration from whatever it wants to do because they are clearly democratic and they clearly have certain values that they won't budge from. So essentially the belief that norms, laws, institutions will keep government overreach from not happening or will push back authoritarianism if needed. I think by now, these assumptions that I just mentioned are completely gone. The idea that courts maybe still a little bit, universities not really, the press to a certain extent are immune to capture that has really evaporated, I feel like. On the contrary, I think we're witnessing actually something even worse, is that many of them are not just captured, but they are actively aligning at times with this new political course. Take Colombia, take Paramount. You've described similar dynamics in Hungary. How does it happen in your view? Is it fear? Is it opportunism maybe? Or is it something more structural maybe?
Well, it's both fear, it's opportunism, which have their structural roots. Let me step back a little bit because one of my favorite books is on the long history of democracy and capitalism. I think the title is Capitalist Development and Democracy. And it looks at many, many cases across history. Who are the most important political forces pushing for democracy? And there is this general belief that economic elites, by definition, are for the rule of law, for democracy. And in some cases they are, but in many cases they are not. They make compromises because they want to continue making profits. And if they fear redistribution, if they fear too much democracy costs too much, this is something that Hungarian billionaires were actively saying repeatedly, that democracy costs too much. Then they won't support democratic forces. They will support strongmen who bring order into the chaos. And we see this across history, from Allende in Chile, from Germany under the Nazi regime. Across history, you see cooperation between business elites and autocrats, right? Not every case. In some cases, they fight back, but there's no clear rule. If democracy is developing, in most cases, most consistently, it develops and sustains when it's supported by organized masses, especially organizations like trade unions, labor unions, but also large civil society groups. So you need this kind of mass foundation for democracy, a kind of bottom-up cross-class coalition with middle and working class social groups. If you don't have that, it's very, very difficult, almost impossible to sustain democracy. And I think this is related to the first part of your question, where you frame institutions as basically things of the past, that they're not defending themselves. And I think this is a crucial point. While institutions are really important for democracy to work, they are never self-sustaining. They are not like these self-executing automatisms. Institutions work in a social context. They are embedded socially in social and economic forces. And when those social and economic forces change, institutions will change also. And this is what we need to realize, that this applies also to the institutions of democracy. And again, I would like to refer back, if people don't fear electing strongmen into power who might destroy liberal democratic institutions, then they might vote for them. But I would also add that, in many cases, what people want is not really destroying democracy. They want radical change. They want new hope, especially economic hope. But they just don't care so much for the liberal democratic niceties as we maybe would wish for. But this is related to the fact of the lack of performance of liberal democracies, which undermines the social coalition that sustains that. So I think what we need is really to rethink what democracy is. Democracy is not just a set of institutions. It's not about norms that are then codified into institutions through beautiful constitutions. Hungary had a beautiful constitution. Tunisia had a beautiful constitution. Britain during the Arab Spring in the early 2010s. Yet democracy collapsed in both countries under the weight of economic injustices. I think this is one of the key insights that I emphasize in my book, but that applies to a lot of the other cases, that you cannot sustain democracy in a social and economically unsustainable situation without social and economic cohesion.
You've mentioned your book, The Retreat of Liberal Democracy, and you have also been part of a party whose name I love. That's the predecessor of the Green Party in Hungary, and it's called Politics Can Be Different, right? In the literal translation, I think. When you look back at your time in the party and at your time in politics, in parliament, and the work that you've been doing, is there any point where your perspective on how to resist authoritarianism changed? Is there anything that you would have done differently? Or you said you even chained yourself to the parliament, so you've been pretty activist in your approach. Do you think all of that was valuable and right? Is there anything that you've later picked up on or learned that you would have applied? I'm looking for advice to Americans on how to deal with this situation and how to actually resist.
Yeah, that's a great question. Just a side story, if I may. The politics can be different is, as you said, is a literal translation. But another way of translating it would be another politics is possible. But that doesn't really come as natural in English, so politics can be different is the English translation. But I just wanted to highlight this because another politics is possible comes from another world is possible. So we just switched another world to politics. And that was a key slogan of the global justice movements in the 2000s. And many of us came from that kind of green and global justice movement scene, which also influenced the name of our party. But then I would say we were not successful in kind of mainstreaming that approach. And it's not just about the resistance of liberal democratic elites, which was massive. It's the same story as we observe in other countries. But I think we also committed mistakes and errors. For example, although I mentioned this chaining action, where we chained ourselves to the parliament, even though we had quite a few actions and organized demonstrations, unfortunately, I would say too much of our energy and the energy of the majority of the opposition went on reacting the daily frontal assaults on institutions by Orbán. And I think in some cases, you have to keep your eye on the ball, which is how do I win the election? What's the way of winning the next election? And if you react always to what the government is doing, then you don't have the chance to develop your narrative, to build up an alternative policy vision, moral vision, emotional vision. And that's a big problem. So I think although it's really important to push back as much as possible against each of the steps, and there are different domains. In the US, legal battles might play a bigger role than in the case of Hungary or most other European countries, just because the American system is so much more based on legal disputes. So I would add that. Also, actors in the media, I wish owners of the media would be more conscious in fighting back as opposed to just selling out. You mentioned Paramount and the CBS, and I had discussions with American journalists about how the cancellation of Stephen Colbert resembles very similar stories in Hungary, how media owners are willing to cooperate in return for continued ability to make profits. So that's something I would wish to see more pushback happening. But at the same time, we also need to maintain a longer horizon and concentrate and focus on projecting a vision about a new type of social and economic and political system that we would want. And if you just keep on reacting and defending, and if we come across as forces that defend the old status quo, then I think liberals have won. So I think that's one of the mistakes from the strategy of the opposition that I would like to highlight.
What's at the heart of a potential solution or resistance in your mind? Is it coalition building, which you've mentioned earlier? Viktor Orbán in Hungary was very adept at the idea of coalition building, of binding together a sort of new social contract, workers, nationalists, segments of the business elite, and creating his own coalition, more or less. Trump has been doing less of that, I feel like, but still you could say that just large parts are folding into this kind of nationalistic and authoritarian agenda, more or less. Does the counter project need the same thing, wide coalition building, or is there something else that you would see at the center of resisting authoritarianism?
No, I think that is a key part of the project. Very often, liberal democratic parties have these targeted messages fine-tuned to the needs of specific groups. Often these groups are defined in demographic terms, and then we fine-tune messages to these relatively small demographic groups. But it's not a winning strategy. I think this kind of approach might have worked for a short period in the 90s, but it was never a long-term winning strategy. So you need a narrative, you need a political identity that unites a large enough social coalition, and that is impossible to do without large segments of lower classes, including underclass voters, including various segments of the working class, middle class voters. And yes, you also need money. You need also at least some level of support from business elites. So you need that as well. So that's a very broad social coalition. And I think that's a crucial part of political strategic thinking, to think in terms of these long-term social coalitions. One of the key tasks of politics is to build these alliances across cultures, across classes, across different parts of society and unite them on a progressive, transformative vision. I think that kind of insight has gotten lost too much over the decades, where politics has been transformed into this professional machinery, fine-tuning the messages, whatever. But as you said, while illiberals do the fine-tuning of the messages as well, they also came up with an idea of how to unite a very diverse social coalition that is, in many cases, in the most successful cases, is more powerful than anything else on the left or on the center of the political spectrum. Certainly, I would say Orbán and Erdogan are the masters of this, but we've seen similar trends in Poland. It's not a coincidence that the presidency has been won by the radical right in Poland. Romania is getting close. The Democrats have united across the aisle, but they've just barely managed to beat the radical right. Trump has managed to put together this diverse social coalition, but I fully agree with you that the way he governs differs from at least the initial period of Orbanism. It looks like Trump is less interested in maintaining that social coalition and is like just more into business making and whatever. The tariff war is going to cost the working class electorates that supported Trump. There's just too much destruction and not enough building there, which also gives hope for the opposition to reassemble a majoritarian coalition. But that won't work if you just approach politics from this professional technocratic angle. And you need to approach it through symbolic politics, to symbols that can unite us, caring, listening to people's needs, not just talking to them, but having discussions with them and amplifying their voices. And not talking downwards. These all matters. These are symbolic issues, but the radical right has become so much more powerful at symbolic politics. But this has not always been the case. Pride has been a key issue for workers. Many of the messages or slogans that the radical right is using, like the countries or shared home, is Volkshemmet. This was a key term in Sweden about how we need to kind of have this caring home that we can all inhabit and have a future in. These are symbolic issues. These are terms that can unify broad segments of society. And of course, you have to have the policy visions. But I think the policies are secondary. I mean, I don't want to belittle them, but first you need to have the symbolic kind of game in order, and then you can move to policies. Too often, technocratic politicians move too quickly to the policies, and then they wonder why people are not listening.
I mean, that's essentially what happened to the Biden administration. They passed a lot of very good policies, and in the end, nobody really talked about it very much. I think that's a totally relevant point. Still, I'm struck in the US, and I wonder how you see this and whether that is like an avenue of hope going forward by, and I think you mentioned this earlier, by how different kind of politics can exist in the same country and how different opportunities arise. You already mentioned the primaries in New York. I mean, that a person like Zoran Mamdani can exist in the same timeline that Donald Trump exists and kind of appeal to the same demographics that Donald Trump would appeal to in many cases is almost unfathomable to me. I'm sometimes surprised how many different ways of politics can work in the US and appeal to the same people. Does it instill hope with you, or do you think that's just such a little tiny example that it doesn't really help?
Of course, it's a small example and you cannot generalize the exact same model, the Mamdani model, but I think to me, it gives a lot of hope. It's one of the most hopeful developments from around the world recently, if you ask me personally. And it's not an isolated incident as well. The US has had this power to produce these populist forces. Sanders never managed to win the primaries, but had a huge influence. So I think that is something that in most cases in Europe is not there anymore. I mean, if you look at Spain, the mainstream social democrats did a pretty good job in learning from Podemos. So I would say that's one of the best examples. But if you look at the UK, how the center has closed in on against Corbyn. I'm not the biggest Corbyn fan, but I think his politics pointed in the right direction. I mean, it's no wonder that you now have 600,000 people signed up for his new party that doesn't even have a name, because there's such an alienation with mainstream politics. And that's because the elites never really made their peace with the fact that Corbyn should have a chance of transforming Labour. And that was still the biggest innovation in European politics. And if you look at elsewhere, I think we don't have the same kind of diversity. So the US is a huge country with lots of pockets, the institutions at the local governmental level, state level, where you can experiment. And that is, you still speak the same language. You still live in the same country from California up to Maine. So it's just like very diverse. Europe is not unified in the same degree. So although, there might be a few Hungarians who get hope from the Portuguese or Spanish left, I don't think it has the same effect as, a New York primary has on thinking in other parts. That's why I was saying that I think for all of its shortcomings, I have slightly more hope for innovation to happen in American politics. Now, I don't have any illusions that there will be always massive resistance against this from business elites. You can see how it's still going on in the US, and large part of the Democratic Party is fighting a battle against Mamdani because he wants to tax the billionaires. But there's no way to reverse wealth inequality and income inequality and ensure a minimum decent level of economic future and economic security from the majority of population if you don't dare to tax wealthy people. But they will always fight back. So this is not going to be an easy, a thing to do. So you need to be ready to fight those kind of counter-hegemonic battles with all the institutions, organizing, mass organizing, and journalism and narrative building. That needs to be ready. But I think there's a hope that someone will pop up in the US system and kind of lead a successful charge against Trumpism. The big question is how much influence this kind of new progressive movement will have on that kind of leader who maybe you don't even know who that is going to be. And then hopefully these same forces will get stronger again in Europe, which again, I'm much more pessimistic about.
Pessimistic and optimistic is a good way to end this. I've recently heard the term radical optimism mentioned by someone. I found that to be a notion that I can really relate to as a progressive right now. The sense that you need to preserve some kind of optimism, and that this sense of optimism is almost radical given what's going on. You've written a book called The Retreat of Liberal Democracy. You've done a lot of research in the field. You're mapping the forces eroding our democracy at close range. Is there a strategy, a tactic that you use to stay optimistic?
This is such a great question. And this has been really at the heart of my thinking and kind of emotional work in the last few years. And it's tough. But one of the things that I keep on coming back to are two things, basically. There are always forces out there in politics that give you hope. Lula comes out of prison and beats Bolsonaro. Mamdani wins in New York. There are always things that you can look at. Even if the world is headed towards a zombie apocalypse, there are these forces that you can look at for inspiration. And then there is a deeper, more kind of emotional layer, if you like, that even if you think that in the short run there's no hope to make a difference, speaking truth to power is the only way to maintain your sanity. That's the only way to behave in a morally justified and dignified way. And in the long run, it pays out. In the short run, it might not work politically. You might end up in a minority position. But maintaining that ability of speaking truth to power, even when it appears hopeless, is a radical act of disobedience and radical optimism that builds up towards a better future in the long run.
Gábor Scheiring, thank you for taking the time.
Thank you so much for this amazing discussion. Sorry, my cat just decided that he wants to join our session.